My friends, we meet together for one purpose only: to come into the recognition of the presence that has always been with us. Not to gain something new, not to add anything to our spiritual stature, but simply to awaken to what has been true from the beginning. The great error of the human experience is the belief that we are separated from God and therefore must search, must strive, must seek in order to find him. For thousands of years, men and women have wandered from teacher to teacher, from religion to religion, from book to book, all with the sincere hope that somewhere, somehow, God will be discovered. And yet, all the while, the very presence they seek has been resting within their own being, quietly, peacefully, patiently, awaiting recognition. You see, the spiritual journey is not a journey toward God. If it were, we would be forever traveling, forever yearning, forever reaching for something always just beyond our grasp. But the truth, which has been proclaimed by the great mystics of every age, is that God is closer than breathing, nearer than hands and feet, and that the search for God ends not in finding him, but in realizing that we were never separate in the first place. It is this realization that marks the end of spiritual seeking, not because we have gained all wisdom, not because we have reached the end of learning, but because we have discovered the futility of looking outside ourselves for that which can only be known within. Now, this recognition does not come through effort. You cannot think your way into the presence of God. You cannot struggle your way into harmony, nor can you petition an external deity to come down and fill your life with grace. God is not out there to be reached. God is the very life, the very being, the very consciousness that is functioning as you. And so the moment we stop seeking, the moment we relinquish this ceaseless turning outward for help, for salvation, for answers, that is the moment a new life begins. It is the moment of awakening. You may ask, if I stop seeking, will I not become passive? Will I not remain in ignorance? No, my friends. True seeking ends only when realization begins, and realization does not come through effort, but through stillness, through the willingness to be silent, to listen, to receive. For too long, we have busied ourselves with spiritual striving, reading, studying, repeating affirmations, pleading for God's intervention. All this activity springs from one root belief that God is absent and must be found. But once you see that God is already the very essence of your being, all this striving loses its meaning, not because it is wrong, but because it is unnecessary. Imagine, for a moment, a man searching desperately for his glasses, turning the house upside down, asking everyone for help. Only after exhausting himself does he discover the glasses have been resting upon his head the entire time. His seeking was sincere, even earnest, but it was founded upon a false assumption. So too with the spiritual search. When we begin to understand that the kingdom of God is within us, within our own consciousness, then the desire to beg or to seek collapses. What remains is a quiet expectancy, a gentle turning inward, and a willingness to let the presence reveal itself. There is a profound peace that comes when we stop searching for God as though he were lost. There is a deep rest that flows into our being when we realize that the entire spiritual journey is not a journey at all, but an unveiling. God is not to be attained, but to be recognized. This is the purpose of our coming together now, not to acquire anything new, not to accumulate spiritual truths as though they were objects, but to enter a state of receptivity in which the truth may reveal itself to us. And so, let us begin by setting aside every desire to get, to achieve, to reach God. Let us, for this hour, rest in the assurance that the presence we seek is already here. The moment we stop seeking, we create the space for awareness. And in awareness, the Christ is revealed. This is the end of seeking, not the end of growth, not the end of unfoldment, but the end of believing that God is somewhere else. We rest, we listen, and gradually we awaken to the truth that we and the Father are one. That is our starting point, and from here the entire path unfolds in grace. My friends, as we continue in this contemplation, let us look together at the central misunderstanding that has burdened humanity for centuries. The belief that God exists somewhere outside of ourselves, to be approached, petitioned, or persuaded. This misconception forms the very foundation of human suffering. For the instant we conceive of God as external, we also conceive of ourselves as separated from that which is our life, our light, our being. From that false sense of separation arises fear, loneliness, insecurity, and the endless striving for what we believe we lack. Observe how instinctively the human mind reaches outward. It imagines a God in the sky, a God in a temple, a God in a book, a God in a distant heaven. And so the individual bows, prays, implores, always to a presence believed to be elsewhere. Century after century, humanity has worn itself thin with this outward effort, not realizing that the very act of reaching outward denies the truth of God's omnipresence. For if God be omnipresent, where is there to go to find God? If God fills all space, what space is left in which God is absent? And if God is the very life of you, then what distance exists between you and that which is your very breath? No one can find God outside himself, because there is no outside himself in which God exists. There is only one infinite presence, one infinite life, one infinite consciousness expressing itself as individual being. The moment we accept a God external to ourselves, we erect a barrier in consciousness that does not exist in reality. And it is this imagined barrier that becomes the source of all seeking, all pleading, all spiritual frustration. Understand this well. No one is separate from God. Separation exists only as a belief, not as a fact. The belief may be strong, it may be long held, it may be supported by centuries of tradition, but it remains a belief, and no belief has power to alter the nature of truth. The truth is that God expresses itself as your very being. The life you are living is not a life apart from God. It is God appearing as individual life. The consciousness you call mine is, in its essence, the consciousness of the One. When you look out upon this world, it is the infinite I that sees. When you breathe, it is the breath of the Spirit. When you live, it is the activity of God expressing as your existence. But the moment we imagine a God apart from us, we begin to fear, for now there seems to be a self greater than us that might withhold good or punish wrongdoing. We begin to plead because we imagine that this separate God possesses something we lack. We begin to struggle, convinced that spiritual attainment depends on reaching a distant divinity. All of this arises from one mistaken notion: God is elsewhere. Let us now examine the effect this belief has on prayer. When you believe God is outside, prayer becomes petition. It becomes God, give me. God, help me. God, come to me. But who is this God to whom you pray? If he is external, then you are separate. And if you are separate, you are incomplete. And if you are incomplete, then no amount of prayer will convince an external power to complete you. But when you begin to perceive that God is the very substance of your being, prayer changes. It ceases to be an act of reaching and becomes an act of resting. You are no longer asking something to enter your life. You are recognizing the presence that has never left. You no longer fear what life may bring. Because you realize life is the activity of God. You no longer search for answers outside, for the answer is within your own consciousness, revealed in quietness. The great barrier between you and God has never existed in truth. It exists only in belief. Remove the belief, and the presence stands revealed. It is like a man who stands before the ocean and believes he is separate from its depth. He fills a cup with water and calls that cup me and the ocean God. He prays to the ocean to fill the cup, to protect it, to sustain it. Yet all the while, the water in the cup is the ocean in miniature. It is not separate in substance. It is only separate in form, and even that separation is temporary. When the cup breaks, the water returns to its source and is recognized for what it always was. So with us, we are not separate beings trying to reach God. We are the infinite appearing as individual form. And when the belief in separation dissolves, we find that the presence we sought has always been our own identity. This is the great misconception humanity must outgrow. Not that God is loving or powerful, that much is known, but that God is external, distant, apart. For when that misconception is corrected, we rest in a peace never known before. We cease striving, we cease seeking, we cease fearing. We become still, and in that stillness we discover the secret. God is the life that I am. God is the being that I am. God is the consciousness through which I see, hear, and live. When this recognition dawns, the spiritual journey changes entirely. It becomes an inner unveiling rather than an outward search. It becomes a quiet listening instead of a desperate plea. It becomes a surrender to what already is. And this, my friends, is the first great step toward living as the Christ within. Let us now turn our attention to a subject that lies at the very heart of the spiritual life, the nature of the Christ. Unless we understand this rightly, all further unfoldment becomes clouded, because every error in metaphysics, every confusion in our spiritual practice, arises from a mistaken concept of the Christ. When we hear the word Christ, the human mind immediately runs to a person, Jesus. And while Jesus embodied the Christ with such purity that he became the living demonstration of it, the Christ itself is not confined to him. The Christ is not a person. The Christ is not a man. The Christ is not an historical figure. The Christ is a spiritual presence, a divine reality, a universal sonship that is the true identity of every individual on earth. Just as sunlight shines through a window without becoming the window, the Christ shines through the individual without becoming confined to that individual form. Jesus realized this perfectly. He lived in such transparency that nothing of the human self obstructed the flow of that divine presence. But the Christ did not begin with him, nor did it end with him. It is the eternal nature of God expressing as individual being. When the Master said, "I can of mine own self do nothing," he was revealing a profound truth. The personal sense of I has no power, no wisdom, no substance. The only power is the divine wisdom, the divine life, the divine love, what he called the Father. But then he said, "The Father within me doeth the works," and that indwelling presence, that inner light, that eternal life is the Christ. What, then, is the Christ within you? It is the true self behind the mask of personality. It is the spiritual identity untouched by time, by age, by circumstance. It is the life that never began and will never end. It is the presence that does not grow, does not diminish, does not move from place to place. The Christ is the fullness of God expressed as the substance, the activity, and the form of your very being. The human self comes and goes, changes and fluctuates, fears and desires, But the Christ is constant, harmonious, complete. It does not look to the world for supply, because it is itself the expression of infinite supply. It does not look to the world for love, because it is the very nature of love. It does not look to the world for safety, because it is one with the only power that exists. The Christ is not something you will become, it is something you already are. The spiritual journey is not a process of attaining Christhood, it is a process of uncovering it. Imagine a seed placed in the darkness of the soil. Within that seed is the full pattern of the tree, the fruit, the leaves, the flowers. The tree does not have to be added to it. It must only unfold from within. So it is with you. The fullness of your spiritual identity is held within the depths of your own being, awaiting nothing but recognition. You cannot make yourself the Christ. You cannot develop the Christ. You cannot meditate your way into becoming what you already are. The more you try to become, the more you affirm that you are not. And so the path of the mystic is not to strive for enlightenment, but to rest in the awareness that the Christ, the very presence of God, constitutes your identity now. When you begin to perceive this, even faintly, something extraordinary happens. You no longer live as a separate I, depending on your personal strength, your personal wisdom, your personal ability. You begin to sense another presence within a presence that is gentle yet powerful, silent yet luminous, still yet infinitely alive. This presence does not shout, it does not compel, it does not force itself upon you. It reveals itself in the quiet moments, when you release the belief in a personal self and become aware of the living spirit that animates your being. The Christ is the individualized expression of the infinite. It is God as you, not the human you, not the physical you, not the psychological you, but the spiritual essence that is your true selfhood. And this realization marks a turning point, for once you sense this inner presence, you will never again think of God as external. You will never again imagine that the divine is something to be achieved or attained. You will know, in some measure, that the very life you feel beating in your chest is the life of God. This is why the end of seeking is the beginning of realization. For as long as we seek outwardly, we overlook the treasure within. But the moment we turn inward, the veil begins to lift, and the Christ, the living presence, makes itself known. This Christ within you is the healer, the guide, the supply, the peace, not because it gives you these things, but because it is these things. You cannot receive peace from the Christ. You can only recognize that peace is your nature. You cannot receive guidance from the Christ. You can only awaken to the fact that infinite intelligence is the mind through which you function. This is the revelation that transforms the entire spiritual path. Not a new belief, not a new practice, not a new philosophy, but the recognition that the life you have called me is and always has been the life of God, expressing itself as individual being. And so, as we move forward, remember, we are not here to become spiritual beings. We are here to recognize that we already are. We are not here to rise to Christ consciousness. We are here to realize that the Christ is the very fabric of our consciousness now. Thus begins the inner unfolding. Now that we have touched the nature of the Christ within, it becomes necessary to understand why so much of the world's spiritual effort bears so little fruit. For though humanity is sincere in its longing for God, the approach taken is often contrary to the very nature of spiritual awakening. Seeking fails, my friends, because seeking is based upon the assumption of lack. And consciousness, the creative medium through which all experience unfolds, can only reveal what is entertained within it. If you seek God as though God were absent, the very act of seeking is a declaration of separation. And what you accept as true in your consciousness becomes the law unto your experience. This is why the Master said, resist not evil. He was not instructing passivity or moral indifference. He was revealing a spiritual law. Resistance strengthens that which you resist, just as seeking reinforces that which you believe you lack. Seeking God is, in effect, resisting the truth that God is already the substance of your being. No one can find God through effort. No one can reach God through striving. The more you strain to touch infinity, the more you confirm your belief in finitude. We must come to understand that God is not a prize to be gained, nor a distant power to be captivated by human desire. God is omnipresence. If there were any place where God is not, even for a moment, God would not be infinite. And if God is infinite, then God must be the very essence of your own being. Seeking fails because it attempts to travel from where you are to where you already are. It attempts to bring God to a place where God already is. It attempts to attain a presence that was never absent. But the human mind cannot grasp this because the human mind is conditioned to believe in cause and effect, in movement, in effort, in acquisition. It imagines that spiritual attainment must follow the same pattern as material attainment. But spiritual realization is not the result of human endeavor. It is the fruit of spiritual receptivity. And spiritual receptivity is born of non-resistance. Non-resistance does not mean apathy or indifference. It means the cessation of struggle, the quiet, surrendered recognition that the infinite cannot be approached through personal will. It means letting go of the belief that we must bring God into our experience through mental effort, emotional intensity, or spiritual technique. When we surrender the urge to get, to reach, to make something happen, we create the inner atmosphere in which the presence reveals itself. This is why the mystic sits in silence, not to achieve something, not to accumulate spiritual merit, not even to improve his condition, but simply to be still. In stillness, the personal sense of I relaxes, and the true I, the Christ, comes forward. In stillness, the mind becomes a transparent instrument through which spiritual intuition may flow. Seeking fails because it is noisy, it is restless, it is anxious. It is an activity of the mind insisting that it must do something to realize God. But God is not realized through the activity of the mind. God is realized through the silence behind the mind. Let me say this as gently and clearly as possible. You cannot bring God into your experience. You can only remove the mental resistance that obscures the God that is already present. Imagine the ocean. If you thrash about in the water, attempting to capture its calmness, you disturb its stillness. But if you become quiet, the waters settle of their own nature. So it is with the presence of God. The more we strive, the more we agitate the inner waters of consciousness, the more we resist, the more turbulent the mind becomes. But when we stop trying to achieve, the waters clear, and the reflection of the infinite becomes visible. Seeking reinforces separation. Non-resistance reveals unity. Once this principle is understood, we no longer attempt to pray ourselves into harmony. We no longer attempt to affirm ourselves into abundance. We no longer attempt to meditate ourselves into illumination. Instead, we rest in the assurance that harmony, abundance, and illumination are inherent in the presence that indwells us. This is not a passive state. It is a profoundly alert, receptive stillness, a listening attitude. In this non-resistant openness, the presence moves of its own accord. It reveals itself unfolds, expresses, performs that which we could never accomplish through personal effort. This is why spiritual realization often dawns not in moments of intense effort, but in moments of surrender, not in striving, but in yielding, not in seeking, but in resting. For the presence of God is not something to be found, it is something to be unveiled. And the unveiling takes place only when the mind ceases its attempts to manipulate, control, or attain. When the impulse to seek subsides, a new life begins, the life of receptivity, the life of inner stillness, the life of awareness. This is the doorway through which the Christ shines forth. Let us now turn to what is perhaps the most sacred aspect of our work, the silence. For in the silence, God is known, not as a concept, not as a belief, not as a hope or an idea, but as the living presence, the very life that animates our being. Throughout the ages, seekers have filled their lives with prayer, with ritual, with study, with affirmation, believing that these activities would bring them closer to God. But only a few discovered that God is not found in words, nor in the repetition of phrases, nor in the accumulation of spiritual knowledge. God is found in the stillness behind all of these. The silence is not the absence of sound. It is the absence of mental noise, the quieting of the personal self with all its desires, fears, and efforts to control life. It is the stilling of that inner restlessness that insists it must find God, reach God, or convince God to act. In the silence, we discover something astonishing. God is not waiting to be found. God is waiting to be acknowledged. There is nothing for us to do but to be still, to let the personal mind loosen its grasp, to rest from the ceaseless activity of thinking, desiring, striving, to release the belief that the mind must achieve something. In the silence, we come face to face with the realization that God has always been present, but our attention has been too occupied with the world, with thought, with personal concerns to perceive it. The silence is the inner sanctuary, the Holy of Holies, where the human ceases and the divine begins to reveal itself. You may wonder, what am I to do in this silence? And I must answer, nothing. There is nothing to do, nothing to think, nothing to repeat. If there is any movement, let it be inward, downward, into quietness. If there is any activity, let it be receptivity, an open, listening attitude. True meditation, as we speak of it in this work, is not an act of the mind. It is the suspension of the mind. It is the gentle sinking into awareness, into the felt sense of presence, without the intrusion of thought. You do not reach God through effort. You recognize God in the space created by surrender. Think of the ocean once more. If the surface is stirred by wind or storm, it cannot reflect the sky. But when the waters grow still, the infinite heavens are mirrored perfectly. So it is with your consciousness. When stirred by fear, desire, or effort, it cannot reflect the divine. But when it becomes still, the presence shines through. The silence is the condition necessary for revelation. In silence, you become aware of a presence, not your own gentle, loving, infinite. It is not separate from you. It is the truth of your being, but it reveals itself only when the human sense of I becomes quiet. In the silence, you may feel a warmth, a peace, a subtle expansion. You may feel nothing at all, but whether you feel it or not, the work is being done. The inner atmosphere is changing. The veils are thinning. The false sense of separation is dissolving. Do not look for sensations. Do not look for signs. Do not look for proof. These belong to the realm of the mind. In the silence, God reveals himself without words, without form, without symbol. God reveals himself as presence, as isness, as the subtle but unmistakable awareness that you are not alone, have never been alone, and could never be alone. The silence is not passive. It is the womb of spiritual birth. It is in the silence that the Christ takes form in consciousness. You may sit quietly for 5 minutes or for an hour. There is no rule. There is no technique. There is only the willingness to be still and to let God be God. As the silence deepens over weeks and months, you will discover that the presence begins to move through you, guiding, loving, expressing, healing without your personal will being involved. This is the activity of the Christ. This is the fruit of non-resistance. In this silence, fear dissolves because there is no personal self to fear. In this silence, loneliness vanishes because it is impossible to feel alone when you sit in the awareness of infinite presence. In this silence, the burdens you have carried begin to fall away because the Christ reveals that nothing real can ever be threatened. The silence is the answer to every question, the solution to every problem, the fulfillment of every longing, not because the silence fixes the outer world, but because the silence reveals that the outer world cannot add to or subtract from the fullness of your being. This is the sacred ground on which the mystic stands. This is where God is known, not in words, not in thoughts, not in doctrines, but in the quiet where we and the Father are one. As we come into a deeper realization of the silence, a new question naturally arises. If we are no longer to seek God outside ourselves, if we are no longer to pray for God to come to us, then how are we to live? How are we to meet the needs of daily life? How are we to find supply, guidance, direction, harmony? This question reveals one of the most liberating aspects of the spiritual life. For in truth, we live not by asking, but by recognizing. The human mind believes it must ask for everything it receives, ask for health, ask for employment, ask for protection, ask for abundance, ask for harmony. But that belief is founded upon a false premise, the premise that God is separate from the life we are living. Let us be very clear. You do not receive supply from God. You do not receive protection from God. You do not receive health from God. These are not things given to you. They are the nature of the presence that is your very being. The Christ within you does not give you supply. It is supply. It does not give you life. It is life. It does not give you love. It is love. Everything that God is, the Christ is, and everything the Christ is, you are in your true identity. When the Master said, "It is your Father's good pleasure to give you the kingdom," he was not speaking of an external giving. He was describing the nature of God as the fullness of all good and the nature of you as the transparency through which that fullness expresses. This means that supply is never something you must seek. Supply is something you must permit through recognition. You see, when you ask God for supply, you are declaring that supply is absent. You are identifying yourself with lack and then turning to a power outside yourself to remove the lack. In that very moment, you deny the omnipresence of God. But when you understand that supply is the activity of God expressing itself as your life, you cease asking, you cease pleading, you cease hoping for God to intervene. Instead, you rest in the realization that the fullness of divine abundance is already present, awaiting only your recognition. You do not ask, it unfolds. You do not demand, it reveals. You do not struggle, it expresses. Let us consider the lilies of the field. They toil not, neither do they spin. They do not ask God to grow them. They do not pray for sunlight, nor bargain for water. Their supply is included in their being, and so is yours. To live without asking is not arrogance. It is the highest humility, for it is the surrender of the personal sense of self, the recognition that I of mine own self can do nothing, and the quiet knowing that God as the very essence of your being is forever doing all that needs to be done. You do not need to ask for supply because you are living as the instrument through which infinite supply flows. You do not need to ask for security because the life that you are is eternal and cannot be threatened. You do not need to ask for harmony because God cannot be in conflict with himself. Whatever appears in your outward experience is but the shadow of your inner awareness. When you live from the recognition that the Christ is your source and substance, harmony appears without effort. Opportunities unfold naturally. Relationships become gentle. Challenges resolve themselves without the strain of human will. But notice this, none of this occurs because you have asked. It occurs because you have recognized. Living without asking requires a great shift in consciousness. It requires trusting the invisible. It requires resting in the truth that God is not a giver of things, but the very essence of all that is. You are not seeking supply, you are revealing it. You are not seeking answers, you are hearing them. You are not seeking harmony, you are allowing it to express. The Christ within you is infinite intelligence. It knows where you should be. It knows what you should do. It knows how your life is to unfold. You cannot improve upon the divine plan for your life, nor can you hasten it through personal desire. All you can do and all you need to do is become still and receptive enough to let the plan unfold through you. When you stop asking and begin recognizing, the inner light takes over. It guides, provides, supports, protects, and fulfills, not by responding to your requests, but by expressing its own nature. You are not the author of your life. You are the transparency through which life is expressing itself. And so, let us put aside the habit of asking, begging, or pleading. Let us rest in the quiet, knowing that the fullness of God is the fullness of our being. As we live from this realization, we enter a state of effortless harmony, the state the Hebrews called manna, the state Jesus called the kingdom, the state we, in this work, call simply grace. Grace needs no asking. Grace needs only recognition. As our understanding deepens, something subtle yet profound begins to take place within our consciousness. We discover that life is no longer lived from the standpoint of a personal self striving to achieve, to attain, to control. Instead, life becomes an unfoldment, a revealing of that which has always been present but unnoticed. This shift marks the beginning of impersonal living. Now, do not misunderstand that word impersonal. It does not mean coldness. It does not mean disinterest or detachment from human affection. In fact, impersonal living is the only way to experience genuine love, genuine compassion, genuine unity. For as long as we live from the personal sense of I, our relationships, our decisions, our reactions are all governed by fear, by desire, by self-preservation. But when the personal sense begins to dissolve, and we recognize that the Christ is our identity, we find qualities expressing through us that are not of our own making: patience, gentleness, harmony, wisdom. We find that we respond to life in ways we could never have planned, never have rehearsed, never have forced into being. The personal self is always concerned with its own advancement, its own comfort, its own safety, its own importance. It seeks praise, fears criticism, desires recognition. It worries about tomorrow and regrets yesterday. It looks out upon the world and sees others, people to fear, people to please, people to resist, people to conquer, people to gain advantage over. But the Christ knows nothing of this. When you begin to live as the Christ, you see no other. You see only the one appearing in infinite form. And in that recognition, fear dies, condemnation dies, competition dies. The whole burden of maintaining a personal self falls away. This is the beginning of freedom. The shift into impersonal living occurs quietly. It rarely comes as a sudden leap. It unfolds gradually, like dawn breaking over the horizon. You begin to notice that situations which once disturbed you no longer have the same power. Words that once injured now pass through you like wind through an open window. You feel a growing spaciousness within a silence that does not react, a presence that simply is. You realize that you are no longer making decisions out of personal desire. Instead, you find decisions forming themselves within you effortlessly, gently, with a wisdom that is not your own. You no longer push life, you allow it. And this allowing is not passivity. It is the recognition that the Infinite One is living its life as you. It is the surrender of personal will to divine will, not in the sense of obedience to an outside authority, but in the sense of yielding to the deeper wisdom of your own being. The personal self believes it must plan every detail, must anticipate every challenge, must protect itself from every threat, but the Christ within knows that the Father within doeth the work. The Christ knows that your safety, your supply, your direction, your fulfillment are not matters to be achieved through human effort. They are the natural expression of God being God. You are not responsible for living your life. You are responsible only for recognizing that life, capital L, is living itself through you. This is impersonal living. In this state of consciousness, you do not judge others because you no longer see them through the lens of personality. You see them as the same infinite presence, expressing differently. You do not resent others because there is no self left to resent on behalf of. You do not fear for the future because you know that the future is unfolding from within the one life that you are. This shift brings a great peace, for the burden of me is heavy. When the sense of me begins to fade, life becomes lighter. You find yourself reacting less, listening more. You find yourself speaking less, sensing more. You find yourself desiring less, receiving more. No one can force this shift. No one can manufacture it. It comes when the personal sense of identity is gently surrendered in the silence of recognition. It comes when we cease living from the mind and begin living from the heart of being. It comes when we let go of our insistence on being the doer and become the instrument through which the presence flows. There is an inner joy in impersonal living, a joy without cause, without reason, without object. It is simply the joy of being. It is the joy of God contemplating its own creation within you. As impersonal consciousness continues to unfold, you begin to understand the Master's words more clearly. I and the Father are one. Not I, the human personality, not I, the physical form, but the I that is pure awareness, pure being, pure presence. And when that I becomes the center from which you live, everything changes. Not dramatically, not outwardly, but inwardly, profoundly, silently. This is the shift into impersonal living. It is the doorway to peace, to harmony, to true spiritual freedom. As we move deeper into the spiritual life, we discover that illumination does not come through isolated moments of insight, nor through occasional glimpses of inner peace. Rather, it unfolds through what I call continual recognition, the gentle, repeated acknowledgement of truth throughout the day. This is not a practice in the human sense. It is not something you must remember to do. It is not a discipline imposed upon the mind. It is the natural turning of consciousness toward its source. Continual recognition means that in every circumstance, you quietly acknowledge the presence. Not outwardly, not verbally, but inwardly, silently, as an ever-present background awareness. You do not say, God, come into this situation. Instead, you rest in the realization, God is already here. You do not ask, Father, guide me. Instead, you acknowledge the Father within is already guiding. You do not pray, give me supply. You recognize the fullness of supply is already expressing as my being. Continual recognition is not seeking, it is remembering. Remembering what is true. Remembering what is present. Remembering what is already functioning at the center of your being. It is like lifting a veil again and again, every time the mind attempts to reassert its old habits of fear, desire, or control. There is no struggle in this lifting, no effort, only a gentle turning inward like a flower turning toward the sunlight. In continual recognition, you are not trying to change anything. You are not trying to improve yourself. You are not trying to bring more of God into your experience. You are simply recognizing that God is the only presence, the only power, the only life there is. You are recognizing that the Christ is your identity. You are recognizing that the world of appearances has no power of its own. You are recognizing that harmony is the nature of being, whether visible or invisible. This recognition becomes the atmosphere in which you live. You may be walking, working, resting, speaking with a friend, performing some simple duty, yet underneath it all there is a quiet awareness. I live not by my own life, but by the life that is God. I act not by personal power, but by the presence that moves in me. I am not separate from the infinite. I am the transparency through which it shines. This recognition is continual, not because you force it to be, but because it becomes your natural way of seeing. You begin to notice that the fear which once rose instantly now slows, pauses, fades, for it cannot stand before this recognition. You notice that anger dissolves before it fully forms, because there is no personal self left to defend. You notice that confusion gives way to clarity without effort, because the inner light is always present, always shining. Continual recognition is not an activity of the mind, it is a state of consciousness. It is living from an inner center that does not fluctuate with circumstances. It is dwelling in a presence that does not come and go. It is abiding in the truth that God is the reality of all being. As this recognition becomes more constant, you will find that your outer life grows simpler, gentler, quieter, not because you have changed the outer world, but because you no longer interpret it through the lens of separation. You see everything, every person, every event, every appearance through the transparency of divine presence. A man may speak harshly to you, yet you feel no sting, for you recognize that the Christ is the true identity behind the appearance. A challenge may arise, yet you do not tense, for you recognize that the infinite is unfolding the solution even before the human mind can conceive it. A need may appear, yet you do not panic, for you recognize that supply is the expression of the very presence you are acknowledging. Continual recognition transforms experience not by changing the world, but by revealing the world in its true light. It removes the sense of separation. It ends the illusion of personal struggle. It opens the way for grace to flow without obstruction. Continual recognition is the bridge from impersonal living into spiritual union. It is the state in which the presence becomes tangible, real, near, not as an external deity, but as your very self. And as this recognition becomes steady and natural, you begin to understand what the mystics meant when they said, "In all thy ways acknowledge him," not as an act of will, but as the spontaneous awareness that there is only one, and that one is ever present, ever unfolding, ever complete. This is the way of continual recognition. This is the atmosphere in which the Christ lives, and this is the doorway through which you enter the peace that passeth understanding. And now, as we come to the close of this time together, let us rest in the awareness of all that has been revealed, not as new ideas, not as doctrines, not as concepts to be remembered or repeated, but as the gentle rediscovery of what has always been true. You are not a seeker on a journey toward God. You are the place where God is expressing himself as individual being. You are not a human mind striving for enlightenment. You are the light itself, temporarily hidden by the belief in separation. You are not a soul in need of rescue. You are the divine in unfoldment, infinite in nature, eternal in essence. When the Master said, "Ye are the light of the world," he was not speaking poetically. He was describing the truth of your identity, the Christ, the divine Son, the infinite presence, the very life of God lives as you, breathes as you, expresses as you. There is nothing to become. There is only something to recognize. Living from the Christ identity means living without fear, because you know that the eternal cannot be threatened. It means living without striving, because you know that the infinite needs no help in expressing itself. It means living without judgment, because you recognize the one appearing in many forms. It means living without lack, because the fullness of God is the substance of your being. This life of the Christ is not achieved. It is not earned. It is not the result of effort or discipline. It is revealed as the personal sense fades, as the mind grows quiet, as the heart becomes receptive. You do not live the Christ life by trying to be spiritual. You live it by yielding to the presence that is already within you. You live it by remembering that God is the only life there is. You live it by resting in the silence where the Father and the Son are one. In this awareness, prayer becomes communion, meditation becomes listening, life becomes unfolding, and every moment becomes an opportunity to witness the infinite expressing itself in and as you. As you go forth from this moment, you do not carry a teaching with you. You carry an awareness. You carry the quiet certainty that you are never alone, never separate, never outside the embrace of the infinite. You carry the recognition that the presence within you is the same presence that sustained the saints, the mystics, the prophets, the same presence that animated Jesus, the same presence that breathes the universe into being. And so let us rest now, not in thought, not in effort, but in the simple, sacred knowing. I and the Father are one. The Christ is my true identity. God is living its life as me. This is the end of seeking. This is the beginning of being. This is the silence in which all things are fulfilled. And in that silence, We meet not as separate beings, but as the one life recognizing itself.